This is the Jurassic, the most dangerous age the Earth has ever known. You think you know it from the movies, but the real story is far stranger. A world born from catastrophe, giants built like nothing alive today, seas and skies hiding things we can barely describe. How did a ruined planet become the most spectacular age life has ever seen? Tonight, we walk into all of it, slowly, from the very beginning. Picture a word you've heard your whole life. Jurassic. It arrives wrapped in movie sound. The roar and the chase and the camera shaking as something enormous steps into frame. That version is loud, and it is brief, and it leaves out almost everything that actually mattered. Tonight, we set the movie aside and walk into the real place instead. Slowly, the way you'd wade into water that turns out to be warmer than you expected. The first thing worth holding in your mind is not a creature at all. It's a length of time, and time is the hardest thing for a human mind to feel, honestly. We measure our lives in decades, our histories in centuries, and even those numbers start to blur at the edges. The Jurassic asks you to stretch much further than that, into a span where the words "long ago" stop meaning anything useful. Before we meet a single animal, we have to reckon with how much room this period actually had. How many sunrises, how many seasons, how many lifetimes stacked end to end inside it. So sit with the name for a moment longer. There was a real planet underneath it, with its own sky and its own weather and its own quiet daily rhythms. The question that opens everything is simple and strange at once. If you could stand on that ground, how much of it would you recognize? And how much would feel like a place that had nothing to do with home? But the moment you try to hold that span honestly, it slips. A number like 145 million is easy to say and impossible to feel. And the mind does a quiet thing when it hears it. It rounds the figure down to a really long time and moves on, because there's no lived experience to hang it against. You can picture a year. You can stretch, with effort, toward 1,000. Beyond that, the imagination stops scaling and simply shrugs. And that shrug is the problem, because it flattens the Jurassic into a single hazy picture. One frozen scene of dinosaurs standing in a fern field, as if the whole period happened on one afternoon. The truth is that the distance from the start of the Jurassic to its end is wider than the distance separating some of its most famous animals from us. Whole lineages were born and buried inside it, never overlapping, strangers across time, though we file them under the same word. So the closer you look, the less the period behaves like a setting, and the more it behaves like an ocean of time with its own depths. The familiar things, the rising sun, the falling rain, sit on the surface of that ocean and tempt you to assume the rest was familiar too. But familiarity at the surface tells you nothing about what waits underneath. And the question of how much you'd actually recognize only sharpens the longer that gap of years refuses to shrink to a size you can hold. So when you stand at the edge of the Jurassic and try to take its measure, the number that matters is this: 56 million years. The period opened around 201 million years ago and closed mere 145 million. And inside that span, entire kinds of animals appeared, ruled, and vanished without ever meeting the ones that came before or after them. Human history doesn't compare. Everything we call civilization, the first cities, the first writing. Every empire and every invention, down to the screen you might be holding, fits inside the last 10,000 years, a sliver so thin it would barely register against the Jurassic's depth. That is the first thing the period teaches you. It was not a moment, it was a world that lasted longer than the mind comfortably holds. And the strange comfort is that you would have recognized more of it than you'd expect. The sun climbed and fell on a familiar rhythm. Rain gathered into clouds and fell again. Rivers cut their valleys the way rivers still do. The differences were real, but quiet. The air ran warmer, with no ice locked at either pole, and more carbon dioxide held in the sky, so the planet leaned toward heat rather than cold. Even the tide answered to a moon that sat closer than ours, pulling the seas a little harder against the shore. The Jurassic, then, was not an alien planet. It was this planet, wearing a face from a chapter we arrived far too late to read in person. If this is helping you settle, a quiet tap on the like button helps it reach others looking for the same calm. Back to the story. So, that's the scale we're standing inside, a world so long and so familiar at its surface that it almost feels safe. But comfort is the wrong note to end on, because this place did not ease gently into being. Before any of it could exist, the planet had to pass through something violent enough to nearly end the whole experiment. Stay with me, and you'll see exactly what that was. The disaster waiting at the very bottom of the Jurassic, and why the world we just walked into owes everything to it. A world that was full of life had to come from somewhere, and the instinct is to imagine it easing into being, green spreading gently across an empty land, creatures wandering in to fill the quiet. That picture feels right. It's also wrong, and the truth runs the opposite direction. Before the Jurassic could begin, something had to end, and the ending was not gentle. The period sits on top of a boundary line in the rock, the kind of line geologists read like a scar, and a scar is always evidence that something was torn. Whatever happened at that line happened to the entire planet at once, not to a single coastline or a single unlucky valley. It reached the air, the rain, the oceans, the soil. Here's the part that unsettles people when they first hear it. The lush Jurassic that comes later, the giants, the deep forests, the crowded seas, had a far darker thing standing between it and the world that came before. Before we can watch anything grow, we have to look at what died and at the strange machinery underground that did the killing. The catastrophe and the abundance are tied together more tightly than they seem, and the nature of that knot is the whole reason the Jurassic took the shape it did. But a scar in the rock doesn't explain itself. You can stand at that boundary line and see the change written plainly. One kind of world below, another kind above, and still have no idea what reached across the whole planet at once to draw it. A single eruption couldn't do it. A drifting climate, the slow kind that creeps over millions of years, couldn't kill on that scale, or that fast either. So something larger was at work. And the trouble is that the usual suspects don't fit. The killing wasn't local, wasn't gradual, wasn't the tidy story of one disaster striking one place. It touched the air that animals breathed and the water that filled the seas in the same stretch of time, which means whatever caused it had to be capable of changing the chemistry of an entire world, not just rearranging its furniture. And here's where the unease deepens rather than lifts. We're used to thinking of an extinction as a pure subtraction. A door closing, a column of life crossed off, nothing waiting on the far side of it. Destruction doesn't usually build anything, but the rock keeps hinting that the boundary wasn't only an ending, that something about the very catastrophe was bound up with the world that followed, in a way the simple story of loss can't account for. What could be violent enough to empty a planet, and what exactly came pouring up from underground to do it? That knot won't loosen until we go down to the source. The answer to why the Jurassic looked the way it did is uncomfortable. It was built on a graveyard. The period did not begin with green abundance waiting to be filled. It began at a boundary marked by one of the worst extinctions Earth has ever recorded, and the cause was not a single mountain blowing its top. As Pangaea began to tear along the seam that would one day become the Atlantic, the planet opened a wound called the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, and through it, an entire region bled magma for hundreds of thousands of years. Lava spread across land that would later be North America, South America, Africa, and Europe. What followed was chemistry, not just fire. Carbon dioxide flooded the atmosphere, temperatures climbed, the rain turned acidic, and the oceans soured. Roughly 3 out of every 4 species on Earth simply stopped existing. Something had to clear the way for the world that came next, and this was it. The catastrophe emptied the stage, killing off the established players and leaving their roles vacant. The Jurassic world of giants and strange forests was not the reward for a peaceful inheritance. It was what grew back after the planet nearly erased itself, and every creature that later thrived did so in the space the dying had left behind. So, the green world we know grew straight out of the worst day the planet ever had. That's the strange debt the Jurassic was born owing. But once the dying stopped, the ground refused to settle and let life rest on it. The land itself was already pulling apart underneath every creature standing on it. What that slow tearing did, and how splitting one world into many quietly bent the future of everything living on top, is where this goes next. Once the dying stopped, you might expect the planet to hold still for a while and let life catch its breath. It didn't. The ground itself was already on the move, and it never paused for anything living on top of it. For a long stretch before the Jurassic, the continents had been fused into a single mass, one enormous block of land you could, in theory, have crossed on foot from end to end. That arrangement was about to fall apart, slowly and without drama, on a timescale far too patient for any animal to notice in its lifetime. Something deep beneath the surface was pulling the seams loose. The forces involved weren't weather, weren't tides, weren't anything happening up in the open air. They came from far below, where the planet keeps its heat. The thing to wonder about, as that single landmass begins to split, is not just the geography. Maps are easy to redraw. The harder question is what happens to living things when the ground beneath them stops being one connected world and quietly becomes many. When a population gets cut off from its own kind by a widening gap of water, with no way back across, what does that separation do to it over a span of millions of years? The continents are about to answer that, and the answer reaches into every creature in this story. But land is supposed to be the one thing that holds still. We build our whole sense of permanence on it. Solid ground, firm footing, the floor that doesn't move. The idea that an entire continent could come apart, that the very seam holding the world together could split and keep splitting, runs against everything our instincts tell us about where it's safe to stand. And the trouble for the animals living through it was that nothing about the split announced itself. There was no day the ground cracked open and the message went out. The continents pulled apart at a pace slower than memory, a few centimeters a year, far too gradual for any creature to register inside a single lifetime, yet relentless enough that over enough generations, a forest could find itself on the far side of a sea that hadn't existed when its ancestors arrived. So the danger here isn't dramatic the way a volcano is dramatic. It's quieter and stranger than that. A population doesn't notice the moment it becomes trapped because there is no moment, only a widening that never stops, cutting it off from its own kind, one impassable mile at a time. What does isolation that slow and that total actually do to a living thing? The instinct says nothing much. The ground moves, life adjusts. But the deeper you follow that widening gap, the more it starts to look less like a backdrop and more like a force quietly redirecting the whole future of everything stranded on either side. So the ground itself refused to stay still, and that restlessness turns out to be the engine behind everything that lived on it. Pangaea, the single mass that had held the continents together, started coming apart for a reason buried deep below the surface. Heat rising through the mantle drove slow currents that pushed against the plates above, and where the strain gathered, the crust cracked. Those cracks widened into rifts. The rifts filled with molten rock that cooled into fresh crust, and in that unhurried violence, a new ocean was born. Eastern North America drifted away from northwestern Africa, and the early Atlantic began to fill the gap between them. The consequence reached far beyond geography. New coastlines appeared, shallow seas spread across flooded lowlands, and the Tethys Ocean curved into the heart of the breaking world as a cradle for marine life. Each fragment of land that drifted into isolation became its own separate experiment. Animals stranded on one landmass could no longer breed with their relatives on another, so populations drifted apart in body and behavior, just as the continents drifted apart in space. And that is what the slow grind of geology actually produced. The splitting of Pangaea did not merely rearrange the map, it handed life dozens of isolated grounds to develop on, and on each one, evolution was free to write a different story. So, a single landmass became many, and each fragment turned into its own closed experiment in what life could become. The map had stopped being a backdrop and started steering the story. But before we follow any animal across that changing ground, there's something quieter we've walked straight past: the green itself. Step into a Jurassic forest and you'll feel that something basic is missing, something you've never once thought to notice. And finding out what fed a planet of giants begins right there. Now let life back into the picture, starting with the part that doesn't move and doesn't roar. The plants, they tend to get skipped. The eye goes straight to the animals, to teeth and size and motion, and the green is treated as a backdrop to walk past on the way to something exciting. That's a mistake, and walking into a Jurassic forest would correct it fast. The shapes around you would feel almost right, and then, the longer you looked, increasingly off. something fundamental would be missing. Something so ordinary in your world that you've never once thought to notice it. And its absence would change the look of everything from the canopy down to the dirt at your feet. Hold on to that missing thing, because the green around you is about to matter more than any single animal in this story. Long before we get to the famous creatures, the ones whose names children memorize, there's a quieter question waiting underneath them all. What actually fed a planet of giants? Something had to soak up the sunlight and turn it into the fuel that everything else would eventually eat. And before we meet a single mouth, we need to meet whatever filled it. But step into that green, and your eye keeps snagging on the absence before you can name it. Everything is the wrong shade of right. The trees are tall, the undergrowth is thick, the light filters down the way light does in any forest. And yet, some quiet wrongness keeps pulling at you, a sense that the picture is missing a piece so basic you never learned to see it in the first place. What's gone is color, or rather, one particular kind of it. No petals anywhere. Not a single bloom breaking the green, because the entire idea of a flower hadn't been invented yet. And with it goes everything that depends on flowers. No fruit, no nectar, no grass underfoot. None of the soft and edible world that modern animals take for granted. So now, the puzzle turns sharp. A planet that would soon carry the largest plant eaters ever to exist had to be feeding them from somewhere, and the meadows and grasslands we'd reach for don't exist here yet. None of the obvious sources we picture when we imagine what fills a giant's stomach. Something else had to sit at the bottom of it all, catching the sunlight and turning it into the energy every animal above would draw on. If it wasn't the soft green world we know, then what was holding the entire food chain up? The forest is the answer, but only once we stop walking past it as scenery and start seeing it as the thing everything else depended on. If you walked into a Jurassic forest expecting something familiar, the quiet wrongness would settle on you slowly. There were no flowers anywhere. No grass softened the ground. No blossoms broke the green. None of the flowering plants that color and feed the modern world had evolved yet. What stood instead were the gymnosperms, conifers reaching high overhead, cycads that resembled palms without being palms, ginkgos, and ferns and horsetails crowding the floor into a dense, layered understory. The green was real, but it was a green arranged by rules that no longer govern any landscape you can visit. This is the answer to a question the giants will soon raise. What fed a world of animals the size of buildings? The forests did. These plants formed the base of every food web that followed, and their order on the timeline is not an accident of storytelling. It is cause before effect. Towering herbivores could only exist because towering vegetation existed first to sustain them. Strip the conifers and ferns out of the picture, and the famous long-necked giants have nothing to reach for and no reason to grow tall. The strange flowerless forest was not scenery behind the story. It was the foundation the whole living world was built on, and everything with a stomach in the Jurassic owed its survival to it. So the forests turn out to be the floor the entire living world stood on, strange, flowerless, and feeding everything above them. Nothing with a stomach in the Jurassic survived without them. But a full pantry doesn't decide who gets to eat from it, and the animals you'd expect to inherit this world weren't the ones who did. How a small, overlooked creature ended up ruling a planet that already belonged to something else. That's the turn waiting just ahead. Say the word dinosaur and the image arrives instantly. Rulers of the ancient earth, kings of every landscape, born at the top and staying there. It's such a familiar story that it feels like a fact. It is not how things began. There was a long stretch when dinosaurs were nobody special. They lived in a world that already had its powers in place, already had its large and dangerous and successful animals, and they were not among them. They moved at the edges of that world, small and easy to overlook, surviving on whatever the more impressive creatures didn't bother to claim. Nothing about them in those early days marked them as the line that would one day own the planet. So the real puzzle isn't how strong the dinosaurs were. It's how something so unremarkable ever got its chance at all. Power was already taken. The important roles were already filled by animals built to hold them. And a newcomer at the margins doesn't simply talk its way into the center. For dinosaurs to rise, those animals first had to fall. What removes the powerful and clears the way for the overlooked. But being small and overlooked is not a path to power. It's usually a path to being forgotten. For every lineage that rises, countless others stay marginal forever and then quietly vanish, leaving no descendants and no trace. The early dinosaurs had no obvious advantage that marked them for greatness. They weren't the biggest, weren't the strongest, weren't winning the contests that seemed to matter in the world they were born into, and the world they were born into was already full. Every important role had an occupant, every productive niche was claimed, and the animals holding those positions were established, capable, and in no hurry to surrender anything. A newcomer doesn't simply outwork its way past entrenched competitors that are larger and better armed. Under ordinary conditions, the dinosaurs should have stayed exactly where they were, at the edges, in the margins, going nowhere. So the rise demands an explanation that they were better can't provide, because for a long time they plainly weren't. Something had to break the existing order from the outside, hard enough to topple the powerful without also wiping out the small. That's a narrow needle to thread. A blow gentle enough to spare the underdogs would usually leave the rulers standing. A blow severe enough to bring down the rulers would usually take the underdogs with them. What kind of catastrophe kills the strong and spares the weak? And why would the meek inherit anything at all? Here is the part that overturns the usual image. Dinosaurs did not arrive as champions. They began as underdogs that got lucky. For millions of years, through the preceding Triassic, they shared the land with reptiles that were larger and more successful. The stocky Rawasuchians with their crushing jaws, the armored etosaurs, the crocodile-shaped phytosaurs lurking in the waterways. Against those rivals, the early dinosaurs were small and unremarkable. Creatures like Eoraptor and Heterosaurus were no bigger than a modern dog, agile and quiet, scratching out a living in the margins, while more imposing animals held the center. Then the extinction that opened the Jurassic changed who was left standing. The catastrophe that tore through Pangaea wiped out most of the dinosaurs' competitors and emptied the niches they had filled. The survivors that crept into those open spaces were small, many of them feathered and probably warm-blooded, and their modest size was the very thing that saved them. Small animals need less food, shelter more easily from extreme weather, and breed faster, so they adapt faster. With their efficient lungs and quick growth, those overlooked survivors spread into every opening and began the diversification that would define the next 100 million years. That is the turning point of the entire story. The giants were not born to rule. They inherited a ruined world, and dominance was the long reward for having been small enough to survive when the powerful did not. So the dinosaurs didn't earn their throne by being the strongest. They inherited a ruined world that the powerful didn't survive, and being small was the very thing that saved them. That's how the underdogs won. But the reward for surviving was a body that should not have been physically possible. How a creature heavier than 10 elephants could stand at all, let alone walk and feed for decades, is the riddle the giants leave behind. And the answer hides inside their bones. Some animals were so large that even now, with the bones laid out in front of us and measured, the numbers feel like a mistake. These are the ones the period is famous for, the long-necked giants whose names you already half know. The creatures so big they've become shorthand for the whole ancient world. It's easy to picture them as just scaled-up versions of ordinary animals, a regular body with the dial turned all the way up. The reality is stranger and more interesting than that. Past a certain size, an animal isn't simply big. It runs into the hard limits of what flesh and bone can physically hold up. Weight climbs faster than strength does. Legs that work fine for a horse would shatter under something 100 times heavier, and a body that massive should, by every rule of basic engineering, struggle to even stand. And yet these animals didn't just stand. They walked, fed, lived full lives, and grew larger than anything that has walked on land before or since. That's the riddle worth sitting with as we look at them. How do you build a living thing on that scale without it collapsing under its own weight? The solution was hiding inside their bodies, in a place you'd never think to look, and it's cleverer than brute strength ever could have been. But size is not free, and nature usually punishes it hard. Every time an animal doubles its dimensions, its weight grows far faster than the bone and muscle meant to carry it, which is why there's a ceiling on how large a land animal can get before its own body becomes the thing that kills it. Legs thicken into useless pillars. Hearts strain to push blood uphill. The bigger you build, the more the laws of physics line up against you. And the sauropods didn't just nudge against that ceiling. They sailed clean through it, reaching sizes that should have left them unable to stand, let alone walk, feed, and live for decades. A body that long should have needed a neck so heavy that no muscle could lift it, fed by a heart so large it could never beat fast enough to matter. On paper, the animal doesn't work. It collapses under the weight of its own blueprint before it takes a step. So either the rules bend for creatures this big, or the creatures found a way to bend the rules. There's no third option. Something about how these giants were built had to cheat the brutal arithmetic that caps every other land animal, far smaller. And whatever that something was, it had to solve the weight problem and the breathing problem at the same time, without trading one away for the other. The bones themselves are hiding the trick, and it sits in the last place anyone would think to look for strength. The reward for surviving was scale beyond anything the land had carried before, or has carried since. The sauropods, Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, and their kin, became the largest animals ever to walk the earth, and the question their body's force is simple. How does a creature that heavy not collapse under itself? The answer is engineering. Their necks were strings of enormously elongated vertebrae that lifted their small heads into the high canopy no other animal could reach, and their tails ran just as long, working as counterweights for balance, as weapons for defense, and even as instruments of communication. The deeper trick was hidden inside the bones. A single sauropod vertebra could be as large as a kitchen chair, yet much of its interior was air rather than solid bone, hollowed into a precise lattice of columns and struts that placed strength exactly where the stress fell and left empty space everywhere else. It is the same principle that lets an aircraft frame be both light and strong, paired with a respiratory system that pulled the most possible oxygen from every breath. That is how the impossible became routine. These animals were not giants in spite of their bodies, but because of a design that made enormous size survivable. And they spent their days turning the conifer forests into flesh on a scale nothing has matched since. So, the giants cheated the limits of size with a trick buried in their own skeletons. Bones built light and strong at once, turning whole forests into the largest bodies the land has ever carried. The engineering held, but that much walking flesh is an invitation, and a world of giant plant eaters is also a world of things that hunt them. What predator and prey did to each other across millions of years, and why this is the age the title is really about, is where we're headed now. Where there is that much meat walking around, something is always going to come for it. A world of giant plant eaters is also, by necessity, a world of things that hunt them, and that's where the period earns its reputation. Imagine the daily arithmetic of being prey here. You are large, but largeness alone doesn't save you, because what hunts you has grown large enough to match. Every meal a predator wants is a meal that can fight back, and every defense a plant eater builds is a problem the hunter has to solve. Neither side gets to rest. The pressure never lifts, because the moment one side gains an edge, the other has no choice but to answer or be erased. The real thing to watch isn't the weapons, impressive as they are, the plates, the spikes, the jaws. It's the relationship between them. Why does a plant eater grow armor heavy enough to slow its whole body down? Why does a hunter learn patience instead of simply charging? These animals didn't develop in isolation. Each one was shaped by the thing trying to kill it or eat it. The danger of this age wasn't random violence. It was a contest, and the contest had rules. And once you see them, the brutality starts to look less like chaos and more like design. But an arms race has no finish line, and that's exactly what makes it merciless. The instant a plant eater grows armor thick enough to turn a predator away, the pressure shifts. Now the only hunters that eat are the ones that find a way through it, and so the hunters change, and the prey must change again in answer. Neither side is ever allowed to win, because winning would end the chase, and the chase never ends. And every solution drags its own cost. Armor is heavy, and heavy is slow, so the very plating that saves a herbivore from a bite makes it easier to corner. A tail built to break bone is a magnificent weapon and a terrible burden, expensive to grow and exhausting to swing. The predator faces the mirror image of the same bind, The jaws strong enough to crack a defended animal are jaws that take years to develop and a single bad gamble to lose. So the danger here isn't the simple story of teeth meeting flesh. It's that survival had become a problem with no stable answer, where every adaptation invited a counter, and standing still for even a few generations meant falling behind and dying out. The hunter that hesitates starves. The prey that relaxes is eaten. So what does it actually cost an animal to stay in a race that never lets up? And what kind of world is left when the price of merely surviving climbs that high? This is where the period earns the word dangerous, and nothing about that danger was an accident. Predator and prey carved each other into shape. Where herbivores grew to enormous size, hunters rose to challenge them. Allosaurus stretched past 30 feet, built with powerful jaws and limbs strong enough to bring down large prey, and it forced its victims to answer or die. The answer arrived as armor. Stegosaurus carried a double row of plates along its back and ended its tail in 4 heavy spikes the cluster paleontologists nicknamed the Thagomizer, capable of punching clean through bone. That hardware turned every hunt into a calculation. An Allosaurus circling a herd of stegosaurs could not simply attack. It had to weigh the meal against the spikes, because a healthy adult could leave it impaled and dying. So the smarter move was to target the juveniles, the sick, the injured, the ones least able to swing that tail. The constant pressure ran both directions. Hunters refining their attacks, while the hunted refined their defenses, each generation pushing the other further. The Jurassic was not dangerous by accident or by temperament. It was dangerous because survival itself had become an arms race, and the weapons on both sides were the product of millions of years of one side trying to outlast the other. So the danger wasn't random violence. It was an arms race with no finish line. Each weapon answered by armor, each defense answered by a sharper attack. Both sides locked in a contest neither could ever win. That's what made the land so lethal. But the land was only part of this planet. Most of it was water, running by rules of its own, where reptiles had gone so far back into the sea that some may never have returned to dry ground at all. Everything so far has happened on dry land, under open sky. But most of the Jurassic planet wasn't land at all. It was water, and the water had a world all to itself, obeying laws we'd barely recognize, almost entirely out of sight from the one we've been watching. If the land animals seem strange, the ocean is where the story gets genuinely hard to picture. Down there, the rules ran differently, and the creatures that ruled the deep didn't look like fish, and didn't look like anything you could point to today and say it's basically that. Some of the most successful hunters in those seas were reptiles, air-breathing animals whose ancestors had walked on land and then turned around and gone back into the water, reshaping their entire bodies to belong there. That return raises a question worth holding as we go under the surface. When an animal abandons the land its lineage came from and gives itself over to the sea, how far does that change actually go? There's one piece of evidence, a single, almost unbelievable fossil. That answers it more directly than any other, frozen in stone, in the middle of a moment no one expected to ever see. The oceans of this period weren't a calmer corner of the world. They were a separate one. But going back to the sea is not as simple as wading in. An air-breathing animal that abandons the land takes its lungs with it, and lungs are useless underwater. They have to be surfaced, refilled, managed against the constant pull of drowning. Everything about a body built for walking fights against a life spent swimming, from the way it moves, to the way it breathes, to the way it holds heat. And the hardest problem of all is the one that decides whether a lineage survives at all. How do you have young? A land reptile lays eggs on dry ground, in a nest, in the open air its embryos need. An animal that has committed fully to the open ocean can't crawl ashore to lay them without surrendering the very thing that made it a master of the water. Yet eggs left in the sea would drown as surely as their parents would on land. So a trap closes around any creature that tries to belong wholly to the water. The deeper it commits to the sea, the further it drifts from the dry ground its reproduction still seems to demand. A contradiction sharp enough that it should, by every expectation, force the animal to keep one foot on the shore forever. And yet some of these hunters appear to have cut that last tie entirely, to have stopped returning to land at all. How a creature does that, how it solves the one problem that should have been impossible to solve at sea, is the question the water won't answer on its own. While the giants fought it out on land, the seas were running an experiment with no modern parallel, one whose predators we can only name by pointing at animals that didn't exist yet. Ichthyosaurs cut through the water in the streamlined shape of dolphins long before dolphins would evolve, a case of the same solution being discovered twice by entirely unrelated lineages. Beside them swam the plesiosaurs, their long necks and broad flippers built for a different style of hunting, while ammonites drifted through the water in countless coiled shells. One fossil answers a question the others only raise: how these creatures reproduced in a world of open sea. A famous ichthyosaur was preserved in the act of giving birth, the baby frozen halfway out of its mother's body, and that single specimen settled the matter. Ichthyosaurs did not haul themselves onto land to lay eggs the way many reptiles did. They gave live birth in the water, fully committed to the sea. The Jurassic Ocean was not a quieter version of the land's drama, but a separate world running its own rules, where reptiles had abandoned the shore so completely that they bore their young in open water and never looked back. So the ocean's strangest hunters solved the one problem that should have been impossible at sea, bringing live young into open water, never returning to land at all, proved by a single fossil frozen in the middle of birth. The sea had its own answer, but the air held something different, something that didn't belong cleanly to any category we know. A feature we file under bird was already here for entirely other reasons, and what it became points straight out of the Jurassic. Look up from the land and the water, and the air held residence of its own. The Jurassic sky was not empty. Things flew there, and some of them flew well, on a scale that would make a modern bird look modest. But the most important thing happening overhead wasn't the obvious flyer. It was something smaller and easier to miss, moving close to the ground, wearing a feature we usually file under bird without thinking twice. That feature showed up long before anything used it the way we'd assume it should be used. It existed first for entirely different reasons, doing a humble job that had nothing to do with leaving the ground at all, which sets up one of the strangest creatures in the whole period, an animal that scientists, when they first dug it out of fine pale stone, genuinely could not sort into a category. It carried the marks of two completely different kinds of animal at the same time, in one body, as though something had been caught halfway through, becoming something else. What do you call a thing that is clearly part one creature and clearly part another, with no clean line between them? The answer points forward, out of the Jurassic entirely, toward a kind of life that's still flying over your head today. But feathers raise a problem the moment you stop assuming they were made for flying. If an animal wears them long before it can take to the air, then they didn't evolve to lift anything, which means the neat story we tell ourselves, that feathers exist for flight, has the order backwards. Something kept and grew these structures for reasons that had nothing to do with leaving the ground, and that's only the first crack in the tidy picture. When the fossil came out of the pale German stone, it refused to sit in either box the scientists held ready for it. Call it a bird, and the teeth in its jaws say no. Call it a reptile, and the feathers across its wings say no, just as firmly. Every feature that settled the question pointed one way was answered by another feature pointing the opposite way. So the creature became an argument with itself, a single body that two categories both claimed and neither could hold. That's deeply uncomfortable for anyone who wants life sorted into clean kinds, because it suggests the line between a dinosaur and a bird was never a wall at all, only a slow blur we drew a border across long after the fact. If one animal can be honestly counted as both at once, then what does it even mean to say flight or birds began? The answer doesn't close the Jurassic, it opens a door out of it. Look up, and the Jurassic sky held the first hint of a future the period itself would never see. The pterosaurs already ruled the air on leathery wings, the first vertebrates to truly master flight. But the more important story was unfolding closer to the ground, among small feathered theropods whose feathers had nothing to do with flying yet. They were for warmth and for display, doing the job that fur does for a mammal. Those feathers were a tool waiting for a purpose no animal had found. Then came Archaeopteryx, lifted from the fine limestone quarries of Germany, and it puzzled scientists because it refused to belong to one category. It had feathers, wings, and a wishbone, all of them unmistakably bird. It also had teeth set in its jaws, claws on its wings, and a long bony tail, all of them unmistakably dinosaur. It was a mosaic, a single creature caught mid-transition between two worlds, and that is exactly why it matters. Flight did not arrive fully formed. It was assembled slowly out of parts evolved for other reasons. And in this one small animal, you can watch a dinosaur become something that would still be alive long after the Jurassic and its giants had turned to stone. So flight wasn't invented in a single leap. It was assembled slowly out of parts that started as something else, caught mid-change in one small creature that was part dinosaur and part bird at the same time. The line between them was never a war. But while the giants ruled the daylight and the first birds tested the air, something else was alive in the dark, staying small on purpose, asking for nothing. What was the point of that patience, and who the Earth would actually belong to, is where the story finally lands. We've spent this whole journey looking up at the giants, at the hunters, at the things in the sky. For the last segment, look down instead to the ground, to the small and the overlooked, because that's where the real ending of the story was quietly being written. While the enormous animals owned the daylight and the open spaces, something else was alive in the same world, keeping to the dark, staying small on purpose. These creatures had no size to boast of, no armor, no place in the spectacle at all. By every measure, the period seemed to reward. They were losing. Nobody watching the Jurassic at its height would have given them a second glance, let alone bet on them. And here's the question to sit with as we close. In a world that so clearly belonged to the biggest and the most dangerous, what was the point of being tiny and hidden and patient? It looks like a losing strategy right up until the moment the rules change. And the rules always, eventually, change. The Jurassic crowned its giants. But the story of who actually inherited the Earth was being decided by the ones nobody was watching, and the way it turns out is not the way anyone in that ancient world would have guessed. But staying small in a world that rewards size looks like surrender, not strategy. Everything around these creatures was getting bigger, louder, better armed, and they did the opposite. They shrank into the dark and asked for none of it. By every standard the period seemed to set, that's a losing hand, the choice of an animal with no future worth mentioning. And for the entire length of the Jurassic, nothing happened to prove that judgment wrong. The giants kept their grip on the daylight generation after generation, and the small furred things kept their place in the shadows, with no sign the arrangement would ever change. If you had been there to wager on which lineage would still exist 100 million years on, only a fool would have pointed at the trembling thing underfoot instead of the colossus overhead. So the patience of these creatures only makes sense in a way no one alive at the time could have seen. Restraint pays nothing while the world holds steady. Its whole value is locked away, waiting on a change that may never come. To stay small and hidden while everything around you grows is to bet everything on a single idea: that the conditions rewarding the giants won't last. But nothing in the Jurassic suggested those conditions would ever break. So what was the point of all that waiting, and what could possibly make the meek and the overlooked worth more than the kings standing over them? The last answer is the quietest, and it belongs to the animals nobody in the Jurassic would have bet on. The first true mammals had appeared around 225 million years ago, and through the whole age of giants, they stayed tiny, rat-sized, covered in fur, active mostly at night, bearing live young, and chewing with specialized teeth. They did not compete with the dinosaurs for the open world. They survived by staying out of it, scurrying underfoot in the dark, while the great reptiles owned the daylight, asking for nothing the giants wanted. That restraint turns out to be the longest game any lineage has ever played. These small hidden creatures were patient in a way that only made sense across tens of millions of years, holding their place in the shadows generation after generation, while the spectacular animals above them rose and fell. The Jurassic belonged to the giants while it lasted, and no one watching those nights could have guessed how the story ends. But the giants are gone, and the small furred things that waited in the dark became the lineage that produced elephants, whales, and the creature now telling their story. Dominance, in the end, did not go to the largest or the fiercest. It went to the ones quiet enough to survive. Thank you for spending this time in the Jurassic. If it helped you wind down, a like lets others find it too, and you're welcome to leave a comment with whatever stayed with you tonight. Rest well